Time, you see, is not a river. It is a well, deep, still, and filled with things we dare not look too closely at. Moments long submerged fester at the bottom, their echoes warped, their meanings unmoored. But now and then, one rises, and with it, a name I had almost forgotten. Tonight, I draw up a memory nearly lost, of a widow who heard the hour toll not for the living, but for those already forgotten. A clock that measured not life, but erasure, and a name that was once spoken, and now is not. It was the third week of mourning when the crate arrived. Eleanor White, widow of the recently drowned mariner Thomas White, found it waiting on the stoop of her cliffside home, salt-bitten wood, lashed with corroded iron bands, and bearing no return address. The morning fog clung to the weathered clapboards of her cottage, perched precariously on the bluffs overlooking the restless sea that had claimed her husband. Her fingers hesitated on the lid, but grief does not leave much room for suspicion. She opened it with trembling hands, nails cracked and cuticles raw from days spent scrubbing floors to quiet her mind. Inside stood a grandfather clock. No note, no explanation. Just a relic carved from dark yew, its glass face warped as if scorched by some ancient heat. Tarnished brass numerals glinted dully in the weak morning light filtering through her lace curtains. Time sat still within it, the hour hand resting between 11 and 12, unmoving. The minute hand was bent slightly, as though it had once struck something hard. The pendulum, heavy as a heart, hung silent, a disk of polished silver etched with markings too fine to decipher. And yet Eleanor swore she could hear it tick, faintly, somewhere deeper than the ear, a rhythm that matched the pulse in her wrists. She set it in the hall by the hearth, where Thomas's coat still hung, a threadbare woolen thing that smelled of pipe smoke and the peculiar mineral tang of the deep sea. The clock seemed to lean into the empty space where her husband should have been. That night, she dreamed of drowning. It struck for the first time 3 nights later. She had drifted into an uneasy sleep, the wind howling through the moor as waves battered the cliffside, spitting foam against her bedroom window. Her quilt, stitched by her mother 20 years before, twisted around her legs like seaweed. Then came the chime, soft, mournful, and low, a single note that hung in the air like breath suspended. Eleanor sat up, nightgown damp with sweat despite the chill. Her eyes fell to the hallway, now dark, save for a faint blue-tinged glow that pooled around the base of the clock. It did not repeat. When she checked the hands, they had not moved, frozen in their position just before midnight. The pendulum remained still. She pressed her ear to the wood, which felt unnaturally warm against her cheek. Silence, but the smell, salt and decay, lingered in her nostrils. The next morning, she learned that old Marla Bridgen had died in her sleep. Marla, the midwife who had once cradled Eleanor's own infant in bloodied arms, before the fever took the child 3 days later. Marla, with hands strong enough to turn a breech birth, but gentle enough to close the eyes of the departed. Marla, who had not spoken a word since her husband vanished in the fog last year, taken by the same merciless sea that claimed Thomas. When Eleanor attended the modest funeral, she noticed how quickly the villagers dispersed, how their eyes slid away from the fresh-turned earth, how by sunset no one mentioned Marla's name. The chime had come precisely 13 minutes before she passed. By the 4th toll, Eleanor had begun to write them down. Each chime came with no warning, always at night, always a different hour, always for someone in the village. The 2nd toll, 3 hollow rings at 2:30, preceded the passing of young Peter Caldwell, found tangled in his fishing nets at dawn. The third, a discordant cluster at 4:15, marked the end of Widow Harrow, who had outlived 3 husbands, but not the winter chill. The fourth, 9 strikes, brassy and sharp, came before they found the rector's daughter beneath the ice of the village pond, her face peaceful as if in prayer. It did not keep time. It kept death. Eleanor's journal grew thick with observations. The clock never chimed during daylight. The temperature in the hall dropped precipitously before each toll. And most troubling, the names in her records seemed to fade, the ink growing paler with each passing day, until she had to rewrite them. She visited the local vicar, but he only looked through her, distant, as if her words had slipped through the cracks in his hearing. His fingers toyed absently with his collar as he recommended prayer for her lingering melancholy. The doctor offered laudanum and suggested her female humours were disturbed by prolonged grief. The grocer refused to meet her eyes when she asked if he remembered Thomas, mumbling that no such man had ever ordered salt cod and tobacco from his shop. Thomas's name remained unspoken in the town. His pipe still sat on the mantel, but when she mentioned him, heads tilted in confusion. And so, the widow and her clock grew acquainted in silence, companions in a house where the shadows seemed to lengthen regardless of the sun's position. One evening, after the 7th toll, a resonant 5 chimes that preceded the quartermaster's fatal stroke, Eleanor dreamed of the sea. She stood ankle-deep in the surf, the sky split with crimson and gold like a wound that wouldn't close. The water receded, revealing not sand but a floor of ticking gears, half submerged and rusted, stretching to the horizon. Small crabs with clockwork legs scuttled between the mechanisms. The air smelled of brass and brine. In the distance, a figure watched her, tall, familiar, and drowned. Thomas. His clothes hung heavy with water, his beard matted with seaweed. His skin had the waxy pallor of the long dead, but his eyes, those remained the same grey blue she had loved, the colour of the sea before a storm. His face bore no malice, only sorrow. Water trickled from the corners of his mouth when he tried to speak. He raised one arm and pointed inland. When Eleanor turned, she saw her home ablaze. The cliffside cottage burned with silent, methodical flames. No smoke rose, no wood cracked, just the steady consumption of everything she had known. Through the open doorway, she could see the parlour where she'd mended Thomas's socks, the kitchen where they'd shared hard bread and good stories, the bedroom where they'd made a child who never drew breath. From the flames, the clock rose. It floated upward untouched by the fire, its pendulum now swinging wildly. The face had changed. Where numbers had been, there were now names. Her name was at the top, the hands creeping toward it with terrible purpose. She woke screaming, her throat raw, the taste of salt water in her mouth. She awoke with the dream still clinging to her skin, salt in her mouth, her pillow damp as if soaked in seawater. The clock had moved. For the first time its hands were advancing, 1 minute per hour, precise and unswerving. The pendulum swayed left-right with no sound but a faint whisper, like distant voices calling through fog. The room around it had begun to warp subtly, as though caught in some pressure the rest of the house did not know. The floorboards beneath it had darkened, the grain of the wood shifting to form spirals that drew the eye inward. Eleanor approached with caution, a candle in her trembling hand. The flame bent toward the clock, as if pulled. The glass face reflected not her own image but a ghostly procession, the faces of all those whose deaths the clock had foretold. Marla with her knowing eyes, Peter with seaweed in his hair, the rector's daughter pale as moonlight, and beneath the base of the clock, scratched into the wood where she had not seen before, was a name. Her own. Not written, but carved as if by a desperate hand, the letters ragged, uneven, bitten deep into the wood. When she touched them, her fingers came away stained with a dark substance that smelled of iron and salt. Eleanor fled to the shoreline, the journal of tolls clutched in one hand, her shawl whipping around her shoulders in the bitter wind. The tide was out, revealing a stretch of black rocks, slick with seaweed and memory. This was where they had found Thomas's boot, his knife still in its sheath. This was where she had stood for hours, scanning the horizon until her eyes burned. She opened her journal under the grey light of dawn. Each name she had written was now illegible, ink washed into meaningless blot. Only dates remained, orphaned numbers with no purpose. The town, she now realized, no longer remembered the dead. No graves, no records, not even her own husband. She confronted the mayor in the village square, her voice rising above the normal whispers of the town. Where is Thomas White's marker in the cemetery? Where are the records of his drowning? Why does no one speak his name? But he only blinked, confused, as though hearing a language long dead. The villagers gave her a wide berth, crossing themselves surreptitiously when she passed. The Chronicle had begun its work. It did not erase the dead. It erased remembrance. And now it had come for her. She spent the day in the parish records, searching for traces of those taken. Birth entries remained, but deaths were smudged, as if fingers had rubbed at the ink until nothing remained. In the graveyard, stones stood blank where names should be. Marla's freshly dug grave now showed no sign of disturbance, just smooth grass as if decades had passed. As the sun set, Eleanor returned home. The clock's hands had moved closer to her name. 6 hours remained. That night, she sat before the clock. She had brought her tools, Thomas's hammer, her sewing scissors, a box of matches. She had tried to destroy it earlier, but the hammer bounced off the wood without leaving a mark. The scissors broke against the glass. The matches went out before they touched the surface. Now she simply waited, Thomas's wedding ring clutched in her palm, its edges biting into her flesh. It struck 12. Not a chime, an inhale. The clock breathed, the glass fogged, the shadows stretched toward her, long and fingered, bringing with them the scent of deep water and forgotten things. The hands trembled at her name, and Thomas stood behind her once more. Not the drowned spectre from her dreams, but as he had been, beard neatly trimmed, eyes crinkled at the corners, that chip in his front tooth from a dockside brawl in his youth. Solid enough that she could feel his breath on her neck. This time, he whispered, "It doesn't keep you. It keeps what you leave behind." His calloused hand covered hers. "They sent it for me, Ellie, the clock, from a place beneath the waves where memory is currency. I refused to be forgotten." She understood then. The clock had not come for those who died. It came for those who remembered. Each toll marked not a death, but the erasure of someone's memory from the world. "Break the cycle," Thomas urged, his voice breaking, "or there will be nothing left of any of us." With her last strength, Eleanor opened the face and tore the pendulum free. The room imploded into silence. No crash, no wind, only stillness. When the pendulum came loose in her hand, it was not silver, but glass, filled with what looked like black water. Names swirled within it, hundreds, thousands perhaps, in handwriting not her own. She saw Thomas's name rise to the surface, then Marla's, then all the others. The clock began to fold in on itself, the wood splintering inward, the the brass melting like wax. The pendulum grew hot in her hand. She had a choice. Let it shatter and release all the stolen memories, or... Eleanor swallowed the pendulum whole. It burned going down, a trail of fire to her core. But with it came the memories, not just of those the clock had taken, but of thousands before them. She became a vessel for the forgotten, her mind expanding to contain multitudes. She would remember for all of them. The clock remains in that hallway, frozen again, her name no longer etched, her presence, neither ghost nor memory. The villagers say the cliffside cottage stands empty, though sometimes on dark nights when the tide is highest, they swear they can hear a woman's voice reciting names like a prayer. Eleanor White is not buried, nor remembered. No headstone marks her time, no parish keeps her name. But in the margins of the Chronicle, just beside a half-erased entry and a blurred stroke of ink, I found her again. It took time, of course, but then time is all I have, and all I lack.